Welcome to today's webinar, Embedded Instruction to Support Early Learning in RTI Frameworks. This is the 8th webinar in Brooks's RTI and Early Childhood webinar series. We're glad you've all joined us. My name is Christina Davis and I'm a marketing manager on the Early Childhood team at Brooks Publishing. Our webinar today will be presented by Dr. Pat Snyder. In her presentation, Dr. Snyder will introduce the components and practices of embedded instruction and discuss how it focuses on children's learning targets during everyday activities, routines, and transitions to support their participation in the general preschool curriculum. You'll also learn how embedded instruction can be used across tiers of RTI frameworks. Dr. Snyder is the David Lawrence Jr. Endowed Chair in Early Childhood Studies and Director of the Center for Excellence in Early Childhood Studies at the University of Florida. Dr. Snyder's research focuses on the developmental impacts of early experiences in learning, social-emotional foundations of early learning, and how families and practitioners support young children's development and learning. She has more than 35 years' experience in early intervention and early childhood as a direct service provider, program administrator, faculty member, and researcher. Now, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Snyder for her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina, and hello to everyone, and welcome back to those who are coming back to the series in the RTI sessions. I understand there are a number of folks today from Head Start and from early care and education programs, from some ARC programs, also from some community colleges and universities, some public school programs, and folks working in departments of education. So welcome to all of you, and I'm probably familiar with a number of you who are on the phone, and look forward to working with you today for the next hour to talk about embedded instruction to support early learning in response to intervention frameworks. Much of the information that I'm going to be presenting today is also included in the chapter that's published in the Handbook of Response to Intervention in Early Childhood, and you see the reference to that handbook here on the first slide. And I certainly want to acknowledge the participation and contributions of my colleagues and co-authors on that chapter, Mary McLean, Mary Louise Hemeter, Susan Sandall, and Tara McLaughlin. The work that I'm going to be sharing today is actually supported, whoops, slide's not advancing, there we go. The work we're going to be discussing today was supported in part by a grant from the National Center for Special Education Research and the Institute of Education Sciences. It's important to note, however, that the opinions that I'm expressing during the webinar are those of my colleagues and myself and not the funding agency. As many of you know, we've been working on embedded instruction for early learning, and particularly with a focus on embedded instruction for supporting preschool teachers to implement embedded instruction practices with fidelity for about the past 10 years. And so what I'll be sharing today is information, as I mentioned, that's contained in the book chapter, but also information that was informed from the research that we've been doing with teachers and children in the context of preschool classrooms around embedded instruction for early learning. During the webinar today, what I'd like for us to do is take some time to define and illustrate what we mean when we talk about embedded instruction for early learning, and most importantly to talk about 4 components that we think are very important for implementing embedded instruction as intended. And those 4 components focus on what to teach, practices related to what to teach, practices related to when to teach, practices related to how to teach or delivering embedded instruction and embedded instruction trials, and practices focused on how to evaluate. And then, as Christina mentioned, I'll describe how we see embedded instruction fitting in the context of response to intervention frameworks that are being applied in early childhood. So as all of us on the webinar know, a major purpose of instruction in early childhood is to provide sufficient experiences and opportunities for preschool children to learn skills and acquire important dispositions. And the reason it's important for all of us as practitioners to provide sufficient experiences and opportunities for children during the preschool years is so that they can have access to and participate in a high-quality preschool curriculum. Also important because we want to ensure that all children and each child are achieving our desired developmental or learning outcomes. And of course, increasingly, as we all are aware, we want to ensure that young children have sufficient experiences and opportunities during the preschool years so that they're not only are they ready for school, but schools are ready for them. And so today, as we talk about embedded instruction and think about response to intervention frameworks in early childhood, I'd just like to remember, and for all of us to think about, thinking about these pictures of young children learning in the context of everyday activities and routines, and for us to think about the skills or dispositions or competencies that we see these young children in these pictures displaying, and what they might be learning in the context of these everyday activities and routines, and what the implications would be for instruction for these children or for other children who might need additional help to access or participate in the general preschool curriculum to attain important developmental or learning outcomes and to be ready for school. And that's really the essence of response to intervention, as you all know, and for the purposes of our discussion today, the context for embedded instruction. An important foundation as we began to do our work around embedded instruction and talking with teachers and families about embedded instruction in the context of early learning was to think about the important foundation for embedded instruction is really to consider how children learn. And we know from research that children learn from their experiences or their interactions with their physical environment. We also know that children learn from experiences and interactions with their social environment. And we know that children learn simply by observing events in their environment. And events in their environment often are the behaviors of peers or adults that are in their most proximal learning environments. And so as this figure shows, the experiences and observations in activities, routines, and transitions in preschool classrooms are the foundation for the embedded instruction discussion we're going to have today. And children's interests and preferences engage them in social and non-social interactions in their environment, which provides them with learning opportunities, opportunities to practice skills and learn new behaviors. And repeated opportunities to learn obviously result in children mastering important skills or acquiring dispositions that we think are important with respect to approaches to learning, for example. And mastery, of course, then leads to strengthening children's interests and also either building on or modifying their preferences, which again sets the learning cycle in motion. So the essence of embedded instruction is really to think about these issues on the outside of the circle in terms of children's interests and preferences, setting the stage for engagement, their learning opportunities, and their mastery, but also thinking about that occurring in the context of everyday experiences and observations, which means in the context in the preschool classroom of everyday activities, routines, and transitions. The other important development over the past several years, as many of you are aware, and certainly if we look at the books that Ann Epstein has contributed importantly to the field about intentional teaching, we know that from the science of early childhood development, it's no longer an either-or position about whether early experiences in preschool classrooms should be solely child-guided or solely adult-guided to assure optimal learning. But in fact, it's a careful combination of these two things, thinking about both opportunities for children to learn through child-guided experiences as well as adult-guided experiences that result in optimal learning. From the perspective of response to intervention or embedded instruction, we know from the science of early childhood development and learning that for some children, it may be important to have additional adult-guided experiences, or what we might call instruction. For other children, predominantly child-guided experiences might be appropriate and sufficient. The key point, again, is that it's not either or, but rather how to carefully blend child-guided and adult-guided to optimize learning for all children and for each child in the classroom. What practitioners in early care and education do to support children's optimal learning and development and the effectiveness of that support in terms of desired outcomes, as we know, has been characterized as intentional teaching. And we see embedded instruction as one approach that really builds on intentional teaching. So what is embedded instruction? Embedded instruction is a systematic and intentional approach to instruction, and the instruction is implemented during typically occurring activities, routines, and transitions. As I mentioned previously, during today's presentation, we're going to focus on embedded instruction in preschool classrooms. But as all of you know, embedded instruction can be implemented at home or in other everyday learning environments, such as on the playground, at story time at the library, riding in the car, or riding on the bus. Our work around embedded instruction and key components of embedded instruction, and talking with teachers and others, practitioners, about how to best express the essence of embedded instruction, resulted in this schematic that identifies 4 key components of embedded instruction. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about implementing embedded instruction as intended from the embedded instruction approach that we describe in the book chapter, we think about practices that relate to what to teach, and primarily that focuses on identifying what we call priority learning targets. Practices that focus on making decisions about when to teach, which we'll talk about in a little bit, matching the priority learning targets that are identified to which activities, routines, and transitions are most logical for embedded instruction to occur. The third component we talk about is how to teach, and that's really the direct instructional component of embedded instruction. And we'll talk about a concept that we've been working on focused on complete learning trials, complete embedded instruction learning trials, when we think about implementing instruction or how to teach. And then finally, the fourth component focused on how we evaluate the effects of our instruction, both with respect to monitoring our implementation of embedded instruction, as well as evaluating child progress or response to instruction, and then making database decisions about whether or not modifications are needed to either our implementation of instruction or to the ways in which we're evaluating child progress and learning. The next slide just takes those 4 components that I just mentioned, what to teach, when to teach, how to teach, and how to evaluate, and breaks down each of them into a set of practices that we believe are important for implementing embedded instruction as intended. This table comes directly from the book chapter in the Response to Intervention book. We won't have an opportunity today to talk about each of these practices, but in the professional development work that we've been doing around embedded instruction, we certainly are developing the supports related to each of these practices to ensure that early learning practitioners have the knowledge and skills to implement these practices as intended. But I wanted to share this with you just so you could see the ways in which we're thinking about breaking each of those 4 components down into a set of explicit practices related to implementing embedded instruction as intended. I mentioned earlier that embedded instruction builds on intentional teaching, and in the context of response to intervention frameworks, embedded instruction is used when children need additional help or additional targeted learning opportunities. But like all forms of teaching, and similar to considerations related to intentional teaching as shown on the left-hand side of the screen, embedded instruction also is concerned with clearly defined learning objectives, or what it is we're teaching, Embedded instruction considers when and where to teach. In the context of intentional teaching, we think about that as play or activity-based context for where and when to teach. From an intentional teaching perspective, we think about instructional strategies that are likely to help children achieve learning objectives. And embedded instruction, we would talk about that with respect to how to teach. And then in the context of intentional teaching, again, there's an emphasis on continually assessing progress and adjusting strategies based on assessment. And again, in embedded instruction, as I mentioned earlier, we think about the how to evaluate component. So you can see when I say embedded instruction builds on intentional teaching, we see this side-by-side alignment of intentional teaching as it's being defined in early childhood and embedded instruction as we've been thinking about it and applying it for children who need that extra help or additional targeted support. So to illustrate further what's meant by embedded instruction, I'd like to share with you some videos that we've developed as part of our professional development training for practitioners. So it gives us an opportunity to bring to life the concepts that I was just talking about. And since we can't talk to one another today, which is not a comfortable place for me to be as a facilitator, I thought that it might be helpful as you watch the video to think about the questions that I've posed on the slide and to just jot down a few answers to the following questions. First of all, think about what all children are doing during each activity and routine shown on the video. And also think about in what activity or routine are they doing what we're seeing them do. And what might all children be learning, or what could they be learning as a function of the experiences and observations that they're having in these everyday activities and routines. And for the children who are the focus of these videos, who need the extra help or additional instruction, what do you see the practitioners doing that illustrates embedded instruction? And by that I mean, when I say what are they doing for the children who need extra help or need additional instruction, what do you see that illustrates embedded instruction? What I mean by that is what is being taught, where is it being taught, how is it being taught, and did it appear to be working for the child and for the teacher? And then think back to why might this approach to instruction be meaningful for the child based on that learning cycle that we talked about earlier, about building on children's interests and preferences and supporting their engagement so that they can learn in the context of everyday activities and routines. So Christina and I tried this the other day, and we hope the sound works, but if not, if someone would just type "the sound isn't working" in the question box, we'd appreciate it.
Cameron, listen. You can count to 10, and then it's me your turn with the scissors, okay? Ready? 1.
He's coming out next with the color over here.
Yeah. Good job, Sophia.
Julia. I'm right. Apple juice. Good job, quite good.
I hope we can get thirsty.
Thank you.
What do you need? You need glue?
Oh, now you have to open? It's open. Squeeze. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Stop! What do you want? More. Good. 1. Line down, bud. Right now, line down. Little line across. Line across. Zebra's treat is when he eats a tasty slice of panda pizza with lovely toppings on each slice. This pizza does look very nice. Should we count? Pineapple? Oh, that's pepperoni. Ready? Let's count together, guys. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4, nice job. High five. You guys did a great job counting.
So as we can see on the video, we can obviously think about what's being taught, when it's being taught, how it's being taught, and if it appears to be working. The important point is that embedded instruction is distinguished by its emphasis on using intentional and systematic procedures within and across activities, routines, and transitions. And again, for the children who needed extra help or additional instruction, we could see how adults were scaffolding and or directly using instructional procedures to support young children's learning important skills, but contextualized in the context of important and meaningful and engaging activities, routines, and transitions. So we'll come back to some of these examples as we go through the rest of the webinar today. So now that we've seen embedded instruction in action, we're just going to briefly consider each of the components that I mentioned earlier. So the first component, as I mentioned, is what to teach. And what to teach involves identifying the instructional content and specifying those priority learning targets, either for all children, for a group of children, or for an individual child. And as you all know, curricula that are used in early childhood or descriptions of what young children should know or be able to do as specified in early learning standards or guidelines often influences the content focus of instruction in early care and education settings. So this figure shows important considerations that we talk further about when getting in the book chapter about getting started with developing learning targets. And what we hope this figure displays is how priority learning targets identified for embedded instruction align or connect with the curricular content that all children need to learn and experience in preschool classrooms. So if we deconstruct this slide, we see at the bottom two levels in the blue and the light green, we see what we might call within response to intervention frameworks the core curriculum or the Tier 1 curriculum. And we all know that most of the content, either from the perspective of early learning foundations or standards or the general preschool curricula is informed by what it is that we think is important for all children to know or be able to do, therefore often referred to as the universal or Tier 1 kind of content. We also know that practitioners may select targeted curricula, such as an early literacy curriculum or a math curriculum or a social emotional curriculum, because it has content that aligns with the early learning foundations and general curricular content, but it may also contain additional targeted content needed for some children in your classroom. So within a response to intervention framework, these targeted curricula and the content contained in those targeted curricula can be considered Tier 2 content or Tier 2 types of learning targets. And then the content of IEPs, and IEPs are now being expressed as what we want young children with disabilities to learn or be able to do so that they can access and participate in the general preschool curriculum. We understand that the content focus of IEPs should also align with what it is that we would like all children to know or be able to do. And so as we think about that within a response to intervention framework, we might refer to that as Tier 3 type of content because it's highly individualized based on the strengths and priorities and needs of an individual child. It's important to note that IEP goals and objectives are individualized, as we all know, as required by law, but the content of the goals and objectives, and indeed the content of our priority learning targets, should align with the general preschool curriculum, because this ensures that children with disabilities have access to the general preschool curricula. And the content of the IEP should reflect what's most important for the child to know or be able to do to access, participate, and learn as a member of the early childhood learning community in his or her own classroom. Proximal skills, when we talk about priority learning targets, we're thinking about proximal skills that children need to access and participate more fully in the curriculum and to learn those important skills and dispositions that I mentioned earlier. This is just a slide that breaks down then the previous figure that I shared, pulling content from, in this case, some early learning standards from the state of Vermont that our colleagues shared recently with us, aligned in the light green box, as you might see, those early learning standards aligned to teaching strategies, goals, objectives, further aligned with a targeted social emotional curricula that's being used in this particular preschool classroom for those few children who need additional targeted Tier 2 types of instruction, additional instruction and support to learn fair ways to play with peers and to develop peer-to-peer interaction skills. And then at the top level, we see an individualized IEP goal for a young child named Mia, and we show how the content of her learning, her goal, instructional goal, her what to teach, aligns with what it is that other preschool children are learning or are able to do. And then most specifically for Mia, we've written what we might call an instructional learning target at an individualized level that's aligned with her IEP goal. So helpfully, this is a very brief but illustrative example of how we think about what to teach around embedded instruction in the context of response to intervention frameworks. The other important consideration related to what to teach from a response to intervention and embedded instruction approach is to think about how the skill that's specified in the learning target is a proximal instructional priority to improve the relationship between child and environment fit and to support a child's engagement and learning in the ongoing activities, routines, and transitions. And so we want to think about putting the puzzle piece together so that the learning target considers the child's abilities, skills, preferences, and support needs. And then as early learning practitioners, we think about the activities, routines, and transitions that are part of our everyday learning environment, those experiences and observations that are available to young children in our classrooms, and what the characteristics and demands, so to speak, are of those activities, and how we can ensure a fit between the skills that we're embedding instruction on in the context of the activities, routines, and transitions. So we want to avoid just sticking practice in on a particular learning target into any activity, routine, and transition. We want there to be a logical fit. And this is an example by what we mean by a logical fit. So, for example, if a learning target is focused on a child making requests, it might be that snack time would be a natural activity, or in this case routine, in which we could embed learning opportunities for a child to ask a peer to pass juice during snack time. That's a natural match for the learning target. A logical match for the learning target may be something like the second example shown in orange, where in this particular classroom, the teacher has done an analysis of her snack time routine, and it includes different colored bowls and different colored cups as part of the snack routine. And so it's a logical time to embed some learning trials for those children who may need some additional instruction on naming colors, because there are colored bowls and colored cups during snack time. So it's a logical time for embedding. What might not be a logical time for embedding for snack time would be a target or a learning target focused on children pointing to objects in books, because in most preschool classrooms, if we did an activity analysis of snack, oftentimes children are not looking at books or having books read to them during snack time. So when we talk about that fit in the previous slide, this is really what we're asking teachers to do. Think about the characteristics or qualities of their activities, routines, and transitions, and think about the learning targets where those activities, transitions, and routines serve as logical opportunities or natural opportunities in which to embed additional instruction for children who may benefit from that. So that's the what to teach component in 2 or 3 minutes. The next component focuses on a set of practices that's highly related to what to teach, and we've already alluded to it, which is when to teach. And again, to think about the ongoing activities, routines, and transitions that are occurring in preschool classrooms, and to really do a thorough analysis of the activity characteristics and demands, and think about those in relationship to the Early Learning Foundation standards or general preschool curricula that you all are implementing in classrooms. We're aware of at least 4 different types of activities that we can analyze further and think about in terms of your daily schedules in the classroom. And thinking about the activities and activity characteristics and demands. We can think about teacher-directed activities, which are defined as activities, of course, that primarily are led by the teacher. These may be things like circle time, storybook reading, child-initiated activities, which oftentimes in preschool classrooms are centers, and perhaps outdoor play on your schedule is primarily what you would define as a child-initiated activity, meaning children are generally free to initiate what they do in the activities and what materials they use in the activities. Routines appear on everyone's daily schedule, and again, routines being defined as those things that occur with regularity and have pretty predictable beginning, middle, and ends, and those would be things like snack time and meal times and toileting kinds of routines. And then, of course, transitions, which refers to the movement from one activity or routine to another. And so each of these kinds of activities that are reflected on the schedule are the kinds of things that we want to think about in relationship to looking at our schedule, doing an activity analysis, thinking about who's available during these different kinds of activities in the classroom in terms of adults and peers, and when there are logical times to think about doing the embedding in terms of how the learning target fits with the activity, but also what are the resources that are available to support embedded instruction during these different types of activities. This really gets into the planning dimension of embedded instruction, and it is a very important piece of embedded instruction. And there are a number of practices, as I mentioned earlier, that we won't have time to talk about today, but we would, they're referred to in more detail in the book, and there's also additional information about them on our website, and I'll give you all that information about how to access our website at the end of the webinar. So after we think about the learning target in relationship to our schedule and our activity analysis, then we go back and return back to our thoughts about fit. And from that, then, we begin to select times and activities for embedded instruction. And so this embedded instruction could be occurring in the context of classroom-wide activities, such as circle time. It also could be occurring in small group kinds of activities, or it could be occurring for an individual child in the context of either large group, small group, or one-to-one kinds of instruction. But we construct an activity matrix to help ensure that the embedded instruction occurs or the teaching occurs. And what an activity matrix does, and I know many of you are probably familiar with them, and I'll show you an example on the next slide, but it just outlines your daily schedule or your activities and routines, and then identifies the priority learning targets for the children who need the more targeted and intentional learning opportunities, and really cues up everybody in the classroom about targeted times to embed these learning opportunities for the children who need additional help or support. So this is a brief example of an activity matrix in a classroom, and we don't see the full day here, but we see arrival, free play, circle, outside, snack, and free play. And then we see here, these are post-it notes. This is for 3 children who in this classroom the teachers feel like need more additional support or targeted instruction during everyday activities and routines. And so, for example, for arrival time for Anna, we see that she's going to be receiving some additional support around removing her coat. Kiana is going to be receiving additional support around responding to greetings from peers or adults. And actually, the target here is to provide 3 additional opportunities for Kiana to respond to greetings. Again, I want to emphasize that this is instruction that's above and beyond what's happening for all children, including these children. So this is additional instruction above and beyond the core curriculum that all children in the classroom are experiencing. The other thing that you might notice in this particular activity matrix is that the teachers have also decided to distribute embedded instruction trials on the same identified learning target across different activities. So for Anna, for example, we see that on an outside play, she's working on using 2-word phrases, and one of those words in the phrase should be a descriptive word. And she's going to be receiving 2 additional learning opportunities during outside play and 3 additional opportunities during snack. So again, you can see that the teachers have thought about their schedule, the children's learning targets, and how they want to distribute instruction on the learning targets across the activities and routines, and then the number of learning opportunities in some cases that they want to provide, the number of additional learning opportunities that they want to provide. Teachers have shared with us that the use of this kind of activity matrix with the post-it notes is very helpful in the context of a classroom because it helps all team members be on the same page about what the learning targets are for children who might need some additional help and support, and the number of trials that are planned to be implemented. So we've talked a little bit about what to teach. We've talked a little bit about when to teach. The third component of embedded instruction focuses on how to teach. And within response to intervention frameworks, when we think about how to teach, this focuses on the instructional strategies themselves. And so the types and intensity of instructional strategies in embedded instruction are informed by that analysis that I mentioned earlier about child environment fit and where children might need more support. So as practitioners, our response to children who might need more support involves instruction, systematic and intentional instruction being delivered along a continuum. And that continuum can go from less structured to more highly structured, depending on the child's phase of learning, their pace of learning, and the instructional target that we've identified. And so the type and intensity of instruction, of embedded instruction, is really what we're concerned with when we think about the how to teach component of embedded instruction. And also thinking about children's capacity for meeting the environmental or learning task expectations, and then looking at their responses to the learning opportunities that were provided. So if we think about, for example, the little girl who was counting to 10 before she was asked, able to ask her friend to share the scissors. It may be that that child had every capacity to meet the learning task expectation, but what the teacher had decided to do was actually think about the child's capacity to count and wait before she either grabbed the scissors from her peer or asked her peer directly for the scissors. And so making those kinds of instructional decisions, obviously for that teacher, were informed by quite a bit about what that teacher knew about that child, her capacity for meeting the activity characteristics and demands, and what it was that she felt was her learning target that was really important for that little girl to know or be able to do. So if we think about the options we have for how to teach, for how to provide additional learning opportunities for young children, these two options for organizing and structuring children's experiences and observations are less structured, but very important, because these are things that help occasion or provide opportunities for children to learn through their experiences and observations in the preschool classroom. And so we're all familiar with concepts of universal design, and many of us are also very familiar with making modifications, curricular modifications and adaptations to support or provide additional help for children who might need some additional support to access and participate in activities and routines in the preschool curriculum. When we talk about embedded instruction, however, we're talking about intentional and systematic procedures being used, as we saw in the videos, to really support children's learning during everyday activities and routines. And so in the context of embedded instruction, we certainly want to think about universal design principles, and we certainly want to think about modifications and adaptations to organize and structure children's experiences and observations. But when we think about embedded instruction, we also need to think carefully about which specific instructional strategies will support children's development and learning in the context of everyday routines, activities, and transitions. And so we have a number, as you all are familiar, may be familiar with, a number of named procedures that fall into this green box shown on the slide. Naturalistic instructional strategies may be things like milieu teaching or naturalistic time delay. Incidental teaching is another instructional strategy that we consider to be a naturalistic instructional strategy. There are also a variety of response prompting instructional strategies that are available for us to use to support children's learning. during everyday activities and routines. And these would be things such as most to least prompting, least to most prompting, constant time delay as examples of response prompting instructional strategies. And then, of course, we also have a set of procedures that are focused on shaping responses. And children in these, when we use these strategies, these are used to reinforce successive, for example, reinforcing successive approximations toward the learning target behavior and providing children with feedback and consequences. Again, in embedded instruction, we want to think about these strategies as being ones that we would implement and see implemented, particularly in the context of Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction for young children who need additional help and support. In our embedded instruction approach, rather than presenting teachers with a variety of named procedures, we chose to emphasize a concept that I mentioned when the webinar began around complete learning trials, rather than specific instructional procedures such as time delay or most to least prompting. And I really want to emphasize that we're not suggesting that the specific instructional procedures that I just mentioned briefly on the previous slide are not important and shouldn't be used as part of embedded instruction, but rather what we wanted to emphasize in our approach by referring to complete learning trials is that all the embedded instruction learning trials should involve these 3 or 4 primary features, and that the instructional procedures that I mentioned previously involve these 3 or 4 features. So when we think about what we mean by a complete learning trial, we think about and help teachers understand and see, and I'll show an example in a minute, about something that sets the occasion for the behavior, the learning target behavior, and we might refer to that as an antecedent or a cue that sets the occasion for the behavior. And then this would be the learning target behavior itself. And this would be something that follows a logical or planned consequence that follows the learning target behavior. And so we talk about that as an A, B, C, or an antecedent behavior or consequence. That's one type of complete learning trial. In the links down here, we see a second type of complete learning trial where we have a cue in the environment that sets the occasion for a behavior, but that the target behavior doesn't occur. So the adult or a peer might provide, or the environment might provide additional help. And with that additional help or prompt or additional cue, the target behavior occurs, and then that's followed by a logical or naturally occurring consequence. So I'm going to show a really brief example. There are tens of thousands of these that are occurring all day, every day for children in preschool classrooms. And when we made this video, it took us about 3 days to take a 3-second learning trial and break it down into components that we could clearly display to folks what we were talking about these ABC sequences. So they happen very fast in preschool classrooms, but it's really important when we think about embedded instruction to break it down and be really specific about what the intentional instruction is that's occurring. So let's look and see this very brief clip.
Where is the spoon? That is the spoon. Thank you. The yellow spoon.
So in that example, you could see the teacher providing a very complete and quick learning trial related to pointing to pictures and names, which was the the pointing to the picture, the named picture was the target behavior. And you could probably tell from the storybook that they were looking at that there were probably about 6 to 8 opportunities just on that one page in that particular book to actually have 6 or 8 trials in the span of maybe a minute. So again, illustrating the powerful perspective that comes with using intentional and systematic instruction in the context of everyday activities, routines, and transitions to support young children's development and learning. This next video is another example, another quick example. Again, took us a very long time to break this down into its ABC components because the trials happened so quickly in the context of busy preschool classrooms. This is an example of one where the teacher is going to provide some additional help because the target behavior, which is the child responding to positional words that the teacher expresses, the child's response to positional words, the child doesn't get the target behavior the first time, and so we'll see the teacher using an intentional instructional procedure to provide additional help for Matthew. So here we go.
Do not have to go. You're right. Oh, Charlie, sit in the very top corner now. The very top corner. Matthew, you get the very bottom corner. The bottom corner. I think we're ready to add some pizza. At the bottom, there you go. Yep, Charlie got the top and Matthew got the bottom.
So hopefully that was a helpful way to illustrate complete learning trials, how fast they occur, and why it is so important to think about when you're going to teach and how you're going to teach so that when you're in the moment in those busy preschool classrooms and these trials are happening rapidly and often in close succession, you understand the importance of making the links as is illustrated on the slides. So in the remaining time we have together, I thought we would consider EI in the context of RTI frameworks. And so again, this is a figure that's taken from the book chapter. And so when we think about EI and complete learning trials in response to intervention frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, embedded instruction can be used by differentiating or tiering the instruction. And our decisions about the types and intensities of the instruction to be used are based on that analysis of child environment fit about what to teach and when to teach and how to teach to support learning and development. Where there's a lack of fit, we have instruction occurs, and instruction can either alter the learning environment or the child's capacity to interact with the environment. And we make our instructional decisions through direct measurement of the learning opportunities and the child's responses to those opportunities. And that helps us identify the type, the specificity, and the intensity of the instruction that we need to optimize fit. And these are some decision criteria that might be helpful to think about with respect to whether or not the instruction is a good fit in the context of an RTI framework. So I won't go into this in great detail other than to say when we're thinking about embedded instruction at Tier 1, Embedded instruction would be happening in the context of the core instruction that's being provided to all children. So we would need to think about the fact that the dose of embedded instruction provided for some children or for individual children would probably vary based on a number of contextual features, such as the structure of the core curriculum activity or routine, the number of staff available to provide intentional and systematic instruction during the kinds of Tier 1 activities and routines that might be occurring, or the learning targets that are specified for some children or for an individual child. And when you use embedded instruction as part of Tier 1 instruction, children generally need to be able to respond to less precise instruction and to more natural cues and consequences. And when embedded instruction is implemented at Tier 1, we know that it usually is a learning target that requires fewer trials for children to reach the criteria specified on their learning target, and that the child's responses to the logically occurring antecedents and consequences would more often be correct, like in the example we saw with the child counting to 10 during the art activity that children were engaged in. If we go up to Tier 2, within targeted or Tier 2 interventions, embedded instruction would often include more and more precisely, so both more and more precisely implemented learning trials. And it would include more systematic instructional procedures and increases in the numbers of learning opportunities provided and planned increases and decreases in task or activity difficulty. Tier 2 instruction would focus on skill acquisition and building fluency through practice and through increasing motivation to practice in relation to a learning target behavior would be emphasized. And opportunities to respond would occur in the context of activities or routines that often are more structured or adult-directed or involve smaller numbers of children to ensure that you have the appropriate instructional pacing and the available consequences. And more frequent monitoring, as I'm sure you all have heard on other webinars, of embedded instruction implementation, fidelity, and child learning would occur at Tier 2. And then finally, for individualized or Tier 3 interventions, embedded instruction typically would focus on direct, discrete, and precise instruction in the context of ongoing activities, routines, and transitions, often following a scripted instructional plan. And we would want the learning target skills to be taught with systematic response prompting or shaping procedures, and the available contingencies that we identified would be those as we have identified as being motivating for the learner. Again, Tier 3 types of embedded instruction really would focus on skill acquisition and building fluency through repeated practice and through increasing motivation to practice in relation to the target skills, similar to what we would be doing in Tier 2. But in Tier 3, the instructional content that's specified in the learning target more often is focused on what we might consider to be critical skills to support access and participation in the preschool curriculum. And critical skills have been defined as behaviors that, when acquired, set the occasion for either new learning or for more rapid learning of other skills. And some skills that we know that are important for Tier 3 instruction, if children don't have them in their repertoire, would be such things as imitation, initiating interactions, joint attention, and the ability to manipulate objects, for example. In Tier 3 instruction, just as in Tier 2, really important to think about following an instructional protocol or a script, and again, more frequent monitoring of child learning. And again, this type of instruction would be for those few or an individualized child who may need additional help or support. The final component of embedded instruction is how to evaluate. And I just want to mention 3 things that we ask around evaluating embedded instruction because our time is mostly up for today. We focus on asking 3 key questions. The first is am I doing it, meaning am I implementing the embedded instruction trials as intended, meaning the adults. Are the adults providing the kinds of embedded learning opportunities that were planned? The second question is monitoring child progress, or asking, is it working? Is the child making progress? And on the basis of answering, am I doing it and is it working, then we can evaluate whether or not there are changes needed to either the learning target or the instructional plan. So the slide here just shows some data about am I doing it? And I'll quickly say that you can see these are planned trials, these are implemented trials, and these are complete trials, meaning the learning target behavior occurred. And so here what we can see, if we were monitoring our fidelity of implementation, is that for this particular child, we're doing pretty well on the learning target related to colors, and we're doing pretty well on the one related to identifying big and little in terms of planned and implemented, but we're not doing as well on our implementation of providing opportunities, the number of opportunities we had planned. We're implementing only about 10 trials when we had planned across the day to implement about 15 trials on asking for an object. So this illustrates one way that a teacher could monitor the am I doing it piece of embedded instruction. And then this is a graph that shows how we might analyze the is it working. And so in this graph, real briefly, what we can see is that the target behavior was for Mia to ask a peer or adult for an object or toy. And she would ask for that. The criterion was she would ask for that 10. She would ask for 10 items across 3 different activities each day for 4 out of 5 days. And what we see here, of course, is that she's making progress, although not reaching criterion, in asking for objects during free play and lunch. But a teacher would want to think about what might or might not be going on in the outdoor play environment, that they might need to adjust the learning environment or the activity characteristics and demands in that learning environment to provide more opportunities for Mia to ask a peer or an adult for an object or toy during outdoor play. Perhaps children, because the outdoor space area is so big, perhaps children aren't in close proximity to peers or adults, and so the teaching staff might want to think about how they might change up the structure of the outdoor activity if they wanted to embed instruction on this learning target during that activity, and they felt it was logical to do so. So those are the kinds of decisions that we can look at when we think about am I doing it and is it working. So that's the wrap-up. What to teach, when to teach, how to teach, and how to evaluate in the context of thinking about embedded instruction within RTI frameworks. And this is the link that I mentioned earlier to the website, www.embeddedinstruction.net, and you'll find some additional resources there. Also, the chapter, as I mentioned earlier, in the Handbook of Response to Intervention in Early Childhood book has additional information beyond what we were able to talk about on the webinar today. And if you have some specific questions that you'd like answers to, you can contact me at the University of Florida, and this is my email address. Christina asked me to let you know that there are more free webinars coming up on early childhood RTI. There's one scheduled for Thursday, May 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe it's going to be delivered by Dr. Bill Brown.
That's correct.
Christina, do you want to mention the discount and the signing up or viewing the recorded webinars?
Yes. So the link is on your slide, but you will also receive a link to sign up in the follow-up email tomorrow. And just a reminder that because these are recorded, and even if you're not able to come to the webinar on the live date, you should still register because you'll get access to the recorded webinar. So I encourage everyone who's interested to sign up. And then on the next slide, that handbook that Dr. Snyder was mentioning that she has a chapter in. It's featured on your screen, and we are offering a special discount for webinar attendees if you're interested. So there is a 20% code RTI EC20. So if that wraps up your presentation, is that correct?
That is correct, and I want to thank everybody for participating, and please contact me or check out the resources if you'd like additional information or have additional questions.
Well, it looks like we are over time, but there are quite a few people still on the webinar, and so I was thinking that we could just ask a few questions that were submitted by our attendees, since it doesn't look like anybody has anywhere to go too quickly. So Dr. Snyder, one of our attendees wanted to know if embedded instruction in Tier 3 is similar to the traditional ABA discrete trial instruction for children with autism.
No. The important distinction, that's a great question. And again, if you think about when I was talking about Tier 3 instruction, we still, in embedded instruction, would think about that instruction, that those instructional procedures being used in the context of everyday activities, routines, and transitions. So the instructional procedures that are used might be similar to the discrete trial training that would be used for some young children with autism, but the difference would be the context in which the instruction is occurring. And we would assert that it would be important to begin Tier 3 instruction in the context of everyday activities, routines, and transitions. And then if a child is not making progress with respect to their learning target in the context of everyday activities, routines, and transitions, then we might consider doing more isolated discrete trial training.
Great, thank you. And then how about a question on the components of embedded instruction? Do they all need to be implemented as described for it to work, or which ones would you say are particularly important for teachers to implement as intended?
We would assert that all of them are important to implement as intended. That's why we distilled the number of practices down to the 13 that I showed on the slide related to what to teach, when to teach, how to teach, and how to evaluate. What we find often in our work, what we found in our research, is that teachers are able to learn about the what to teach and when to teach components, but oftentimes need more targeted support around the how to teach and how to evaluate components. So I would say that those two, how to teach and how to evaluate, are the components that teachers often need more support to implement as intended. Our workshops, for example, were sufficient in helping teachers learn how to write high-quality learning targets, but they needed additional support either from another teacher or from a coach to really support the implementation of the complete learning trials and to learn how to evaluate their implementation of embedded instruction. But with that support, they were able to do that.
And let's, before we wrap up, let's just get to one more question. So what have you heard from preschool teachers about the embedded instruction approach?
Okay, that's a really great question. I pulled some quotes. Let me share with you some of the quotes from our study. This is a study of 36 preschool teachers in 3 states, and we, after the study was over, we held focus groups to talk to them about their perspectives about embedded instruction. And so these are some of the direct quotes taken from the teachers from our focus group transcripts. Some of them that resonate with me that I think are particularly important is the third one on this slide, where the teacher's saying, I think about it more. When we work on skills during activities, I make sure there's the ABC. And there's the consequence for the child doing a good job, which I never was deliberate about before and didn't realize it. The second teacher on this slide says you can take any kind of situation, any theme, anything that you're doing, and you can embed within it. I think that it is the part that makes embedded instruction so useful. It's natural. It's very natural to use in any kind of situation. These are quite lengthy, but again, one of the things that the first bullet point spoke to me particularly about was many people say at one point or another they've used embedded instruction, but with the approach we've been talking about and researching, we feel like it's become more planned, it was more intentional. This teacher says before the learning opportunities were not planned, there was no system to it, there was no intention, but with embedded instruction, you had to plan it and think what you were going to do. I would think about how many trials I wanted to do and think how I get them in, then I can watch the growth of the children. So, and then the final quote that on this slide, what I like about these embedded learning targets is that you can say, here is the activity matrix, and here is where the differentiation is for each one of the kids. So I think in the context of response to intervention or differentiated instruction, that really illustrates how teachers are thinking about embedded instruction as one way to differentiate instruction in the context of RTI frameworks in early childhood.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation with a lot of great information, and for everyone who's joined us, especially those of you who have stuck on the last 15 minutes. I want to thank you, and I hope to see you on our final webinar, which again is Thursday the 29th, which is on preschool instruction and RTI for children with disabilities. So just to note, this concludes the webinar, and enjoy your afternoon. Goodbye.